Well, thank you so much, Colin, and thanks to the team over at Protocol Labs. I've had such an incredible journey with you all over the last 2 years, and this presentation today is just a short summary of the many things that we have done together. And it comes at a really important time, and so I think a lot of things have aligned to bring us to this point. So I want to talk to you today about the journey that we have taken together, looking at how storage can be a critical part of the pursuit of justice. And this presentation today here is going to cover 3 parts of what we did. One is we looked at accountability, we developed a framework to deal with accountability, and then as we've moved towards the pursuit of justice, we've looked at really the significance about what we think accountability means, and specifically the architecture for accountability in the 21st century. So I want to begin here by bringing us back to 1945. 75 years ago, the Nuremberg trials began, and they were a watershed moment for what we think of as the bedrock foundation of accountability for international human rights law. The Nuremberg trials were held at the end of World War II, and the Allied powers, flushed with victory, decided that they wanted to, instead of using their conquest of the Axis powers as a moment for retribution, they instead wanted to pursue accountability with an eye of creating a precedent for human rights and creating a deterrent from anyone who would ever do something like what the Nazis attempted to do to deter them from ever doing that again. And what's fascinating about this trial, among many things, is the method in which they proceeded to make their case. And going to Robert Jackson, the prosecutor's opening argument, he explained to the people, to the judges of Nuremberg, that we will not ask you to convict any of the men on trial here on the testimony of their foes. There is no count in this indictment that cannot be proved by books and records. The Germans were always meticulous record keepers, he said, and these defendants had their share of a Teutonic passion for thoroughness to put things on paper, and nor were they without vanity. They arranged frequently to be photographed in action, and we will show you their own films. You will see their own conduct and hear their own voices as these defendants reenact for you from the screen some of the events in the course of the conspiracy. So Jackson made a profound choice to not call witnesses to the stand as the key part of his argument, but instead he brought forward documents. In fact, 3,000 tons of documents, photographs, and records were entered into evidence and examined for how they proved unequivocally what the horrors were of the Nazi regime. And interestingly, in those documents, there were some of the first digital records from really mainframe computers that were used by the Nazis to organize a systemic campaign of violence and ultimately genocide. So Nuremberg created this relationship between documentation and accountability, documentation and the prevention of human rights. And what was so powerful about these documents was that they were clearly proven to be authentic because they came from they were created through a central and a certified national authority, which was of course the German government. And when we think about it, it's the German government represented architecturally a centralized form of government. You could argue that fascism is the most extreme form of centralization of a government form. And that was why we believed these documents, as if we understood them to come from the Nazi regime, then we understood that they were in fact evidence of the horrors that they committed. Well, fast forward to today. Look at the war crimes that are being perpetrated every day in Syria. Well, there, the documentation is ever present, and yet it comes from completely different sources. It's a curious inversion of methods of evidence that it's actually the people, not the state, that are the meticulous record keepers here. They are the holders of truths and also mistruths. And the possibilities for this have emerged in large part because of technology that comes from smartphones, where at the beginning of the conflict in Syria in 2011, you had about 472 million smartphones that were shipped in the world. And that obviously 10 years later has gone up exponentially to around 1.6 billion smartphones. And so really when we look at the architecture of this system, we moved away from a centralized form of documentation to a decentralized or ultimately a distributed form of documentation, which in theory is robust, which in theory provides the most amount of documentation possible. And in theory, we should be in good shape. Well, a case that comes to mind of some of the opportunities as well as challenging with these types of documentation is comes from a good case study that you can look at in 2017 in the Syrian town of Khan al-Shaykhun. There in the morning, Syrian fighter jets dropped chemical munitions of sarin gas, and it was a horrific violation of international law. And there was multiple forms of documentation, many on the ground, many coming from smartphones. There was also satellite imagery as well. It came rapidly, it came quickly, and it proved unequivocally that indeed the Syrians had violated international law in using chemical weapons against their own citizens. And yet, the same tools of documentation, which in theory should have helped us in this circumstance here, they were amplified in different ways online, and the most virulent form of distribution actually came from a hashtag which pushed all these images out there, calling the events in Khan al-Shaykhun a hoax. Syria hoax was a hashtag that trended #2 in the United States. And ultimately, what was found later through forensic analysis was that there was a systemic plan of misinformation that was advanced by the Russian government and the Syrian government, which pushed forward this idea of the hoax, and then with terrible irony was amplified by right-wing alt media figures in the United States. And so, this represents, in theory, a crisis of truth. And everyone here, I'm sure, has their own experience with this. And I think we're dealing for the last couple of years with the tremendous fallout from all this. And if you look just a bit to the future, the prospect of synthetic media that can come from deep fakes or other forms of manipulated media, well, they can advance ideas around a hoax like never before. And so there is deep concern for what all of this portends in the future. And moreover, when you look at the ways in which this documentation is put forward, namely on places like social media sites or places like YouTube, you can see that these are not necessarily resilient forms of documentation. If members decide to drop off of YouTube, those videos are no longer available. If they get taken down by YouTube, they're no longer available. So although there are many human rights groups that are doing important work in Syria, they have these incredible challenges of the architecture of documentation. The distributed form of documentation here provides amazing benefits, but also incredible challenges. And so some of the human rights groups have taken it upon themselves to bring down off of social media sites and off major internet platforms into private archives the extensive forms of documentation that exist for human rights violation in places like Syria. And their work is now being fed into accountability mechanisms like the IIIM, which is a UN body that's been set up to begin the process of figuring out what war crimes have transpired in Syria and hopefully be able to bring people to account. So we looked at this context of the possibilities of information, the possibilities of misinformation, and we asked a very simple question. We asked, what if we could establish a single clear chain of evidence that could allow any photograph or any form of documentation on the ground to prove its integrity at each step as you would capture that image, you would then store that image, And then finally, as you would verify that image. Capture, store, verify. These are the three parts of the life cycle of any image and any form of verification of an image. And we felt as though there was an incredible opportunity to bring forward a framework that would allow us to accomplish all of these three tasks and ultimately create an end-to-end signal flow that was open source, that could use a deep root of trust in hardware with next generation processors, use the latest Web3 protocols, and of course, keep that entire system decentralized. And that's ultimately what emerged as the Starling Framework for Data Integrity. It's a joint project between the USC Shoah Foundation and Stanford's Department of Electrical Engineering. We are bringing together a variety of industry players and experts and members from the human rights community, all to advance the cause of human rights and to bring forward prototypes as well as ethics that can allow us to understand how we are going to preserve human history going forward. So I want to take you very quickly through how we do what we do with the Starling Framework. So we begin with the mobile phone, and we use all of the rich sensors that are on that device, such as GPS and gyroscope and time and date coming from external sources. And we take those, that metadata, and we bring it in and we form a metadata file, which then gets married with every single image and video which is taken on the phone. So we have a combination now of an image and metadata that has come together to create a package which can be used to prove that an image was taken at a certain time and place. That package is then hashed on the secure enclave of a processor in the new Exodus 1 mobile phone. And then we take that encrypted hash and the package, and we push it out to the decentralized web. And here's where Protocol Labs come into play. In order to do this effectively and efficiently, we mark every file with a CID, which then allows us to push it out to a decentralized network through IPFS. There, we're able to distribute the files on a variety of different types of storage media. So we can put it with NGOs or with academia or enterprises. We could also put it on individual devices like at servers that are on-prem, laptops, even Raspberry Pis. But most importantly, of course, our big dream was, could we use a mobile phone so that anybody who wanted to store the records of the testimony of genocide or the testimony of human rights violations, that any person with just their mobile phone could contribute. And then we said, well, if we know that we can distribute these files effectively, how could we then improve that as the files were distributed, they also retained their integrity? And that's where we were able to work with the team over at Filecoin with incredible success. And what we were able to do is use the two proofs that come from Filecoin, proof of replication and proof of space-time, to be able to create fixity checks that have really never been done before in any form of secure storage. Because what's so fascinating about the way that Filecoin works is that we're able to use proofs of space-time to ensure that on a random basis and on an ongoing basis, that we can check there has been no degradation of the file and that continuously it has been stored in a way that has not been tampered in any way. That level of certainty around storage is what is ultimately the secret ingredient you might think of as the Filecoin protocol, because what they're able to do is that through creating consensus and creating security through that process, that entire effort cryptographically is actually productive. So unlike Bitcoin or Ethereum, which you have with every form of sealing of a file on the Filecoin network, is you have then also a productive result, which is a proof, secure proof of the integrity of the file. And that holds tremendous promise for the storage and the preservation of media, especially vulnerable forms of media of the kind that we deal with. Well, so we've established a cryptographic chain of custody from capture and storage, but then you still need humans to be in the loop. And that's where we built a verify module to allow humans to create an expert certification to analyze the files and then put their own attestations of the validity of the files on the IBM Hyperledger. And then working with the team at Protocol Labs, we were able to architect a system where we took the results from Hyperledger and then put them not only receive the COMDs and COMDARs from Filecoin, but then we also push them out again to a decentralized ledger with on the Hedera hash graph. So you have a form of interoperability between Filecoin and the HCS, which then allows you to be able to push out the information to anyone who's authorized to see it, the proofs as well as the images onto a decentralized cache that was all browser-based. And so using a gun database, we were able to allow for this form of decentralized cache to allow anyone who sees an image on the web or on social media to be able to access the image, as well as also a cached record of their cryptographic proof and the extensive cryptographic proof that we have. So that is, a tremendous accomplishment, and I'm happy to say that today, that system is operational. So we have the applications on the mobile phones, which were built on a library called Proof Mode that was put together by the folks over at the Guardian Project and Witness. We elaborated on that to then build out a storage module as well on the same mobile phones. We then created a verification module on a desktop application, which allows you to be able to let experts certify all of their analysis. And then under the hood, we were able to create APIs and CLIs working together with folks over at SDI and Postlight Studios to really leverage the full power of the Filecoin protocol. And then last but not least, we worked with the teams over at Canon and over at Reuters to start to take professional imagery, not just from mobile phones, but also from Canon cameras, to then push those out and be able to then display these in, as you see here, a next generation gallery that would allow you to see for every photograph an advanced form of metadata. So you could see exactly where and when a photo was taken. And then finally, if you download that photo, you'd actually have embedded within that all of the metadata, which is following the spec that we helped contribute to that was created by Adobe, the New York Times, and Twitter, called the Content Authenticity Initiative. So those are the incredible innovations that we were able to make in just a little bit under a year. And if that was not enough, what we realized was along the way that all these technical innovations yet still needed to be examined for their possibility, but also their danger. And that's where we worked with the team over at Witness and really followed the guidance from an incredible report they wrote to understand all the various dilemmas that you can have with this form of cryptographic capture, storage, and verification. So we've thought holistically, not just about the technology, but also about the ethics and the implications of how this technology could be adopted. So that brings me to my last point of today. So let's think about the journey that we have here from storage to justice, because it is not inevitable. And specifically in this time, we are facing a crisis of trust of the kind that we've really never seen before, because the tool that we have come to rely on for information dissemination, the internet, has been overwhelmed with mistrust. And we're now in this intensive process of figuring out how did we get here, and there are concrete steps that are being taken to try to address all these problems. And if you read the news every day, fast and furious, there are new proposals that are coming forward. So for instance, just this week, there have been efforts to think about changing the state of the web by potentially changing the state of the big players who are dominating the web, such as this antitrust suit that was filed against Google. On both sides of the aisle, people are considering ways of taking down and modifying Section 230, which is one of the key fundamental principles around how the internet looks at issues around liability and immunity. So any of these changes to the incumbents, changes to the policies of the web, they hold a lot of power. And we need to be careful that in this moment in which we're trying so urgently to deal with the problems that we can see right in front of us, the terrible problems around mistrust and distrust on the internet, we yet need to be careful that we don't make mistakes to overcorrect or make changes that could have potentially far-reaching implications. Because when you look at really the most incredible moments around accountability from this year in 2020, which reverberated from Minneapolis all the way over to Idlib in Syria, what we've come to understand is that there are many things with the internet which actually I think we oftentimes take for granted. And that when we look at accountability, we look at the horrors of accountability, we need to understand that there is actually beneath this an architecture that needs to be thought of to be able to bring forward imagery to change people's hearts and minds. And those images can be aided with cryptography. Cryptography could be used to help protect witnesses. It can be used to clarify imagery. And from accountability, it could even something that could be with certain federal rules of evidence. It could even be self-authenticating. Think about that for a minute. The seals on Filecoin, the cryptographic proofs that come from Filecoin, could be powerful enough on their own that they could allow files that are stored on Filecoin to be admitted with only an affidavit into evidence. No humans would need to be involved. That is an amazing possibility, but it is also an important responsibility for all of us to consider. Because ultimately what that means is that we need to think about trust. And we need to think about the different components of trust and how we as a society are coming to consider what actually is trustworthy. And I want to leave everyone here with a message, which is that when we think about trust, what we ultimately need to remember is that trust is formed through a process of consensus. So much in the way in which Filecoin creates its own forms of technical consensus, the consensus of knowledge requires similar forms of decentralization and distributed systems. We need to break silos to maximize diversity. We need to eliminate misinformation by sharing information. And we need to broaden our evidence base by being able to create webs of knowledge so that there isn't one single ledger of truth, but instead multiple experts are able to come together and we would come to understand their attestations, their expert advice. And what that process would involve is that we would repeat it again and again and again. Because I'd argue to you that the worst possible outcome that we'd have in all of this is that we would have somehow one single ledger of truth. Instead, what we really need to remember is that a distributed system needs to remain distributed at all times. We need to create interoperability, and we need to create integration between systems so that distributed forms of knowledge can remain diverse and remain robust. Because the march that leads us to a distributed system could easily be reversed. And so when we think about the Web3, we really need to consider its core interoperability and allow multiple ledgers to exist to provide diverse cryptographic features, diverse performance characteristics, and diverse methods of preservation. And that, I think, has been one of the more inspiring things about working with the team at Filecoin is that they've come to understand exactly what that vision of a decentralized system truly looks like. And as I was working on this, it struck me that really this form of resilience is something that should be really intuitive and easily for everyone to understand. The way that I think about it is that it's really like biodiversity. That the more variance in a system, the more diversity within a system, the more resilient a system can become and the faster it can evolve. And circling back to where we began and thinking about Nuremberg, I find it so profound that this is exactly what the Nazis never got, which was that diversity was the complete antithesis of the Nazi project. And when you look at their policies of eugenics and their strategy of eugenics, what's so disturbing about them, but ultimately where they were truly held to account was that nature would never, ever let that project succeed. So when you think about our move from storage to justice, remember that we need to think about the architectures of justice and keep them distributed and ultimately allow each of us to be a part of this process, because what we do on a cryptographic level is important, but ultimately it's up to every single one of us to keep these systems powerful. It's up to all of us to keep these systems filled with integrity. All right, and with that, I'll hopefully we have a little bit of time left for questions. Happy to answer any. So Juan asked, how can we help more? Lots to do. We have exciting projects this year that we are working on at Stanford, and all funneling through some really great professors over at the Stanford Law School. So we will definitely have some pretty big announcements in the next couple of weeks, and we're really excited. to continue partnering with the folks over at Filecoin. What I'd offer to the broader audience is that there are many things that we are yet doing with forms of documentation. And so if you have projects or you have things that you think would benefit from this technology and the framework, please do get in touch. And I'll leave my email address in the chat window and be happy to collaborate with anybody who has an inspiring project that we can help.